Hello, my name is Sarah Tyson, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado, Denver. Today I'm talking with Michael Kim, lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, about how he is thinking about the pandemic using the tools and methods of philosophy. Welcome, Michael. Thanks so much for talking with me this morning.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me to do this.
So will you start by telling us a little bit about how you got into philosophy?
Well, in some ways, for me, it was kind of an accident, at least in the professional sense. I got exposed to philosophy in high school when I started doing Lincoln Douglas debate, which, of course, is centered often on social and political philosophy. It became the thing I enjoyed the most in high school. And then in college, I was really more interdisciplinary. I started in a program at the University of Virginia called Social and Political Thought, which is an interdisciplinary major. But when I transferred to Colorado College, the major didn't exist there, and I was forced to choose a discipline.
Mm.
And my credits just happened to transfer into the philosophy department, which fortuitously was continental leaning. And I just stayed in philosophy ever since then.
And so now you teach with the CU Succeed program for CU Denver. Will you just talk a little bit about that program? Because it seems like you are now giving high schoolers an opportunity that you had a taste of through the Lincoln Douglas debate.
Yeah, it's an interesting circle back. So when I first came, I guess, back to Colorado, um, I was offered the opportunity to teach for the program, which is a dual enrollment program run through the University of Colorado Denver, where certain courses are taught to local high school students, usually at the high school campus. So um, instructors like myself, who are lecturers in the department, will travel to a local area high school to offer classes. So in my case, of course, it's philosophy classes. I do both introduction to philosophy and introduction to ethics. And it's a great way for high school students to both be introduced to philosophy, since it's not typically part of a normal high school curriculum. Um, and also just to get a taste of what a college course looks like. The program was started as a way to introduce the college experience to high school students who may not have been considering college um, as a path forward out of high school, to kind of show that it is something that is accessible to everybody. So for that reason as well, it's been a very rewarding experience to
Hmm.
be involved in a program that both attempts to uh, share the experience of philosophy, but also to make college and the college experience more widely available, and to feel more widely available to students who might not otherwise have the opportunity to have exposure um, to these things.
That's great. And you will become the liaison for the department, right, moving forward?
Yes. Um, so starting this next academic year, I'll have the privilege of being the contact person between the various high schools that are interested in offering philosophy courses and the CU Denver Philosophy Department.
So cool. Okay. Well, so I know you've been thinking about the pandemic using the work of Rene Girard and specifically his thinking about scapegoating. So, would you sketch his theory of scapegoating and then how it's been useful to you for thinking about the pandemic?
Sure. I suppose I should preface by saying that, as I think for many of us, this has been a difficult time to not only live, but also to think.
Hmm.
And if there's anything I think philosophy does, and this connects back to what we were just talking about a little bit, for me, one of the helpful things about philosophy has been its capacity to help us make sense of ourselves, our world, and our experiences. So, not just in terms of knowing what and how to act and to do, but just to understand the significance and the meaning of what's happening. And my initial thoughts about, or what my thoughts initially turned to Gerard, when I started seeing and paying attention to the various kinds of eruptions of violence, both potential and actual violence, that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks, both in terms of the lockdown protests, which often feature people open carrying firearms, and also the recent assaults we've been hearing about, for example, of McDonald's employees or Costco employees. And I think there was a Family Dollar incident where either security guards or store employees were either assaulted or shot by customers when the customers were asked to wear a face mask per health guidelines and company policy. And this seemed to me both alarming and dangerous. And so, in that context, there are a couple authors that came to mind as I was trying to think through what's really going on here. On the one hand, as you mentioned, there is Girard, who has a foundational concept called mimetic desire. And the basic idea here is that desire for Girard is paradoxically both social and conflictual. So the reason he calls desire mimetic is that for him, his response to Freudian psychoanalysis is to say that, well, when we have desires, they don't just come from within us, from some inner core or just from a Freudian id or something like this, but rather our desires are what they are because we mimic or mirror desires from other people. So particularly as children, we mimic our parents, both in terms of behavior, but also in terms of what it is that we find important to want or to desire. And in many cases, not all, the consequence of this account of desire, that our desire is never our own, but our desire is our desire because of the desire of somebody else. So in that sense, it's mimetic, but because desires are similar in that respect and tend towards similar objects, this can lead to what he calls rivalry or conflict, when the other person's desire is seen as a threat to my own acquisition of my desires. And so for Girard, this is one of the fundamental sources of violence in society, right? This problem of rivalry. So it's not just a kind of inherent evilness or wickedness that causes us to have tendency toward violence toward each other for Girard, but rather something inherent within the very fact of social living. And this leads to an interpretation of culture and society as one of trying to manage the possibility of this violence as an ever-present threat to human relations. And typically for Girard, the idea is violence is mitigated, or as he will sometimes say, we try to put the longest possible interval between episodes of violence by trying to differentiate, separate, and stagger the various ways in which we might possibly compete for the objects of our desires. One of the primary mechanisms of that separation and deferral of conflict is through something like the ritual sacrifice of a scapegoat. He means this both in the literal practice of scapegoating, of the actual sacrifice of a goat in the religious context, but also, of course, in a more metaphorical context. And so the idea is the scapegoat becomes the third party to which we can export our hostilities and locate that object, the scapegoat, as being the cause of the tension or the disharmony within our society. And then the ritual sacrifice of the scapegoat then becomes the way in which we are able to purge those conflictual and violent tendencies. And he uses this analysis to talk about, throughout history, why, for example, different people or different populations of people tend to be targeted in moments of social crisis. So wars are the obvious example here, where if there's a problem within a society, whether it's economic or social, um, to solve that, it can become an easy way out instead of dealing with those problems to export the blame for those problems onto a third party, onto the scapegoat. So we see, for example, Jews were persecuted during the Black Death because you can't blame nature. So you need to find somebody to blame and to channel that frustration of what you're no longer able to do, the security and comfort of a well-regulated society. And when that's not possible, you see violence start to erupt. And I started to think, well, maybe something like that can help us think about what's happening now during this pandemic. Our lives have been entirely disrupted. Millions of people have lost their jobs. And even those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to still have jobs and income, nevertheless, have had our lives disrupted in other ways as well. And so there's a kind of not only disruption in our lives, but a change in the way in which we're able to negotiate social life, and especially if we're not employed or we're not sure about what the future is going to hold, then our capacity to basically live is threatened. And there's something about not having anyone or anything to blame, right? I might reveal something about my age here, but I think about a scene in an early episode of Family Guy where Peter is supposedly, it turns out he's not, but he was supposedly lost at sea and drowned. And at the memorial service that they hold on the shore, the mayor takes out a knife and starts stabbing the beach to punish the sea for drowning Peter. And that scene just kind of, I think, illustrates, right, this need we have to find someone or something to blame and get revenge when our lives are harmed or when something is taken away from us. And when we can't do that, when the cause of that loss is something like a virus, then we see this almost desperate and urgent need to find something that can be held accountable. So we're seeing, of course, these conspiracy theories about how this is a false flag. The virus was lab created either by the US government to justify this authoritarian lockdown. I presume this is the narrative behind the Plandemic viral video that's going around, which I haven't watched for reasons we can talk about if you want. Or the narratives around, say, Mike Pompeo from the State Department trying to push the narrative that it's a virus that originated in a Wuhan lab, to the tendency on the right to call the virus the Wuhan or the Chinese virus, because doing so gives us at least the illusion that we can blame somebody, right? We can blame the Chinese or the scientists in a lab or some nefarious cabal that is actually responsible for the pandemic. Because if that weren't the case, then there is no one to blame. And then when that happens, and this is, I think, where Girard helps us, or at least helps us understand that this is why these moments of violence can erupt. And I interpret violence here not just as the actual acts of shooting or fighting, but the posturing that happens, for example, in those lockdown protests, or the storming of the Michigan state capitol by people with weapons. So that's kind of one big aspect of why I was interested in returning to Girard to maybe try to think through what's happening, at least at this stage of the pandemic.
Yeah, and so one thing that makes me wonder about is the role of something like conspiracy theories or documentaries as like I guess it's a means of sort of discursively setting up the scapegoat. Is that the sort of function you think they have? That something like the Plandemic sort of functions not as violence, but as the setup to violence or the prelude.
Yeah, I don't know if, and I should say I don't follow Girard in everything,
Sure, sure.
but I don't know if, so in a Girardian analysis, I don't want to say that something like having a conspiracy theory or like the Plandemic documentary is something that justifies the violence,
Hmm.
but rather something, but these are, yes, I think these are practices that help us to sort of channel the violence,
Right. Yeah.
um, which otherwise just kind of lashes out in these moments where, like, okay, oh, you told me to put on a mask. Apparently, in the Family Dollar incident, um, a woman customer was told to put on a face mask by a security guard at the Family Dollar. She went home, told her husband, and then the husband came back later and then trailed the security guard and shot him.
Wow.
So it's like those kinds of moments of irrational eruptions of violence that are the thing that need to be protected against at all costs in a Girardian analysis. And so what social life tries to do is, again, to channel that energy that would otherwise erupt into these moments of violence into more constructive or productive ways. Those, of course, are in scare quotes, which you can't see since we're
Yeah,
audio only.
audio.
But I think that's what those
Yeah,
conspiracy theories do, right? They take
yeah,
that rage and hostility, give it a narrative,
right.
and then give us something to channel it towards, and then it becomes a lockdown protest or something like this.
It's interesting. You're giving me real insight into this experience I keep having when I go for walks, which is you come to a place where you need to negotiate the sidewalk or an intersection with somebody else. And now this is not a simple matter, right, of just walking past one another.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to give 6 feet, this requires somebody stepping off the sidewalk, which I'm willing to be the person who does it, but I always feel angry when somebody doesn't acknowledge that I've done it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel, and it's like, it's not like a being a little annoyed. It's like I'm fully enraged by being unacknowledged in the nice thing I just did, right? Um, and it's interesting to think that part of what might be going on there, right? There's like a desire to just be able to walk, and we're in a situation where you can't just go walk. Um, and it requires these sort of social practices and social coordination. And one of the ways that gets made okay is through sort of polite practices of acknowledgement, right? And that
Yeah.
when those are foregone, that can be inciting.
Yeah, and even in that case, and I love this example because it actually mirrors an example that Girard himself gives us.
Oh, interesting.
I think this is in The One by Whom Scandal Comes. One of the problems with Girard is his work is very scattered. It's very non-systematic. So I could be wrong in this reference,
Hmm.
but he talks about the just the everyday mundane experience of a handshake,
Mm.
which is in many ways similar to your example, right? That there's an action, a social action. So if I extend you my hand for a handshake, Girard knows that there's a problem in no matter what your response is. So if I refuse the handshake, then my refusal becomes an affront to you. I've initiated a moment of conflict and power struggle at that point by refusing your handshake. And so that act immediately can turn us into rivals. So similarly, in your example, right? If you give someone space and they don't reciprocate in the right way, then the
Hmm.
kind of expectations in a good kind of reciprocation has broken down. And then that reciprocity turns conflictual.
Hmm.
On the other hand, if you do return my handshake, what looks like accord nevertheless has the potential to turn into a problematic situation of reciprocity because then I have to make sure that not only have you responded to me in the appropriate way, but then your expectation is for me to acknowledge that you have acknowledged me in the appropriate way. So even the accord and accepting the reciprocity of the handshake or the distancing that you described has the potential for conflict. And this is why the theory of mimetic desire is so interesting, right? Is that my response to your accepting of my handshake or your giving me 6 feet is tied up to how I perceive what your response
Hmm.
is or should be to it, and reciprocally your response to my response has these strangely potentially conflictual dynamics.
Yeah.
And that aspect, I think, has just kind of exacerbated this whole situation, right? We're not really sure how to act. Um, there's all the pressures we feel to be wearing these masks in public, and then the kind of resistance to that if you are someone who believes in these conspiracies, for example, or if you think this is not really a big deal. Just kind of make these everyday mundane places of conflict that Gerard points out just kind of magnify by at least an order of magnitude. So in that respect, I'm not surprised that we're seeing all these instances of both actual and latent violence lately. And unfortunately, I don't know what to do with it, um,
Hmm.
other than the usual thing that we tell ourselves is that just kind of be more aware of ourselves, our own desires, and why we are reacting the way we are. And the thing I find really helpful in Girard is that he reminds us that the mimetic nature of desire tends to hide itself, that we forget that the way we are acting is not just ourselves, but the ways in which we are not only responding to others, but also picturing others and others' desires. And keeping that in mind, I think, can be helpful.
Yeah, there seems like a lot of potential there, right, in the sociality of desire.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot more for us to talk about, so maybe we can circle back around sometime soon. I have all sorts of questions now about trying to seek sort of final solutions to these conflicts, right? And why, and like what kinds of sort of how people try to eliminate conflict. And that part of this, what's compelling about this theory is that that's not possible, right? And so the whatever, however we move forward with this analysis, right, acknowledging the sort of uh, perpetuity of conflict seems really crucial.
Yeah, which I guess is in some ways depressing. But I suppose no more depressing than maybe someone like Freud, right, who has a
Well,
similar
yeah.
notion,
I
right?
mean,
That
depressing if like conflict avoidance seems like like if you have a society built on conflict avoidance or like structures built on conflict avoidance, then perhaps it's even more depressing. Yeah. um
I know we're getting close to the end, but really quickly, I
yeah.
think the other person that's been helpful to me in thinking about this problem that you just mentioned is the little known Danish philosopher Knud Logstrup,
Hmm.
who talks about the fundamental basis for social life being the ethical demand of trust. This notion that um, every social interaction, no matter how fleeting, um, is predicated upon the capacity to trust another person. That when someone enters your life, whether it's just passing on the street, particularly in this context, right, in the pandemic context, there's a way in which that other person has a small amount of influence or power over your life. And so, for that reason alone, trust is fundamental. And one of the things that we're seeing, I think, in our contemporary situation is a complete breakdown of trust. Trust in not other people, trust in media, trust in science, trust in government. And if anyone has seen what happens to a society when trust is replaced by force, it must be someone like Hobbes.
Right.
And I fear that that's the situation that we're looking at, particularly in an environment when we face a situation that requires social cooperation and trust, and that's not there.
Yeah, and where also that needs, and one way to look at that would be to think that's what needs to be built, right? What
Right.
reestablishes trust, right? If you don't take Hobbes to be describing human nature, but be describing human nature under certain conditions, right? Then we could think about what the conditions are and what they ought to be.
Right. How the solution can't just be force, whether it's the force of the state, mandatory lockdowns or something like this, or the force of violence.
Right.
Because and I think he more than anyone saw that, well, that is just the last resort, and bad things happen. Um,
Right.
there's no good outcome if that's the way in which a society tries to deal with its problems.
Right. And eventually bad things happen for everyone, even if you can succeed for a while under that scheme, right? Eventually you lose the capacity to carry the biggest bat in the room, right? Like eventually you too will be overcome. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. And yeah, I do hope we get to come back around for another conversation like this.